Greetings, everyone, and thanks for attending. My name is Enda Brophy, and I teach in the School of Communication, and I'm an associate in the Labor Studies program at Simon Fraser University. I'll serve as the moderator for today's webinar. Learning from Gig Worker Organizing is the first event in Just Recovery, Labor Organizing and the Future We Want, a webinar series hosted by the Labor Studies program at SFU. Featuring the perspectives of workers, labor organizers, and labor studies scholars, this webinar series asks what we can learn from transformations in work and the labor activism that has emerged during COVID-19 in order to build worker power for a post-pandemic economy. While this event takes place in the virtual space of Zoom, it's essential for us to acknowledge that Simon Fraser University lies on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations. I'm currently joining you from North Burnaby on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish and Halkomelem peoples. As the moderator for today's event, I'd like to let you know how it will be run. Attendees are automatically muted and cameras are turned off. We encourage you to submit questions for the speakers at any point during the webinar via the Q&A function, and I'll be reminding people of this regularly during the event. That having been said, we do have well over 100 people in attendance today, so we likely will not be able to have everyone's questions answered, and for that, we apologize in advance. We also want to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and that we will share the details of how to access this recording at a later point by email. The chat will be available for viewing, but is not for posting. So please post questions via the Q&A function. If needed, closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. Click on live transcript and show subtitles. And finally, after the webinar ends, we'd be really appreciative if you could please complete the survey you'll receive by email in order to offer feedback for our next event in the series. Today's webinar zeroes in on gig work conducted via digital platforms. More specifically, we consider the struggles that have emerged from workers at the precarious margins of the platform economy. In recent years, workers at platform companies like Uber, Instacart, Shipt, Amazon, Deliveroo, and others in Europe, Asia, and Latin America have banded together, protesting their precarious conditions and organizing unions. This webinar takes a closer look at two of the more important cases of gig worker organizing in North America, the campaign around gig worker rights in California and the labor organizing drive by Foodora delivery workers in Ontario. The question that frames our discussion today is the following: what is the future of work post-COVID-19, and how do recent struggles to organize gig workers speak to the broader strategies of organizing for a just recovery from the pandemic? We would like to thank our co-sponsor for this event, the Canadian Association of Work and Labor Studies, and Dr. Jeff Dirksen and Dr. Roxanne Pinchazzi through Supervision for the 21st Century, a working group of the Student Experience Initiative at SFU. I'd also like to acknowledge the many hours of work that have been put into this event by the other members of the organizing committee, Michael Ford, Laya Bebahani, Joey Hartman, and Kendra Strauss, as well as the support we've received from Dasha Kotik-N, who clearly did a great job publicizing this event. To give us some perspective on the struggles in Ontario and California, we're joined today by two speakers. Sherry Murphy is a social justice minister in the East Bay, California, and a doctoral student at Graduate Theological University Union in Berkeley. She is also a Lyft driver and lead organizer for Gig Workers Rising. Aaron Spires is a letter carrier at Canada Post, and in 2015 was elected as the national union representative responsible for external organizing for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. He worked with field organizers and Foodora couriers to successfully challenge the couriers' misclassification at the Ontario Labour Relations Board and secure an 89% yes vote in favor of unionization. The respondent for today's event is Veronique Aymon-Soufi, a doctoral student in the Department of Geography at Simon Fraser University, who is studying the click work that supports the data economy. Veronique is particularly interested in how employers avoid place-based labor regulations through digital outsourcing. The format of the event will be the following. Sherry and Aaron will each speak for about 10 minutes, after which Veronique will offer a short summary of the presentation themes and then ask a question of the presenters to get us going. After Aaron and Sherry have answered, we will open the floor to questions from the audience to be submitted via the Q&A feature. And with that, I'll now give the virtual floor to our first presenter, Sherry Murphy of Gig Workers Rising.
Thank you, Indy. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Sherry Murphy. I'm a social justice minister here in Oakland, California. I'm a doctoral student at the Berkeley School of Theology and also a Lyft driver. I'm a driver organizer also with Gig Workers Rising. For some of you who don't know, Gig Workers Rising is a campaign supporting and educating app and platform workers who are organizing for better wages, better conditions, and respect. So in the brief time that I have, I want to give you a brief introduction about how I got started with Lyft, the demographics around gig drivers, and how that impacts our work, and what factors influence our organizing strategies. So I was in my last year of MDiv, my Master's of Divinity, and beginning to start my doctorate program. And I needed something that was conducive to the life of a community minister and student. So in 2017, Lyft seemed like an answer, a godsend. They'd advertised a job with a feature of flexibility that allowed you to make money along with giving you a rental car. I was in that desperate need of that so-called flexibility, and I could use a car. So in the past 3 years, Lyft has been my primary source of income, and I've driven over 12,000 rides. Over the years, as the number of bonuses decreased while the demands to complete rides increased, making major cuts to take-home pay, it was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain a living. Signs of a good deal that never was became painfully clear, and my views of Lyft were shifting, more specifically when COVID-19 hit. In the era of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, it has pulled back the curtain and showed America's diseases for which there still is no vaccine. While drivers were seeking solace in our troubled land, Lyft and Uber were nowhere to be found. When we attempted to secure masks and hand sanitizer, paid sick time off, unemployment wages, and other protective measures, we found obstacles and lack of transparency processes. I know what it's like to work long hours with no guaranteed wages, no work breaks, no restroom facilities, no overtime. I know what it's like to always have the looming threat of an accident with no coverage, a deactivation based on discrimination or some type of retaliation with no protections, no remedies, and no voice. I also know what it's like to be misclassified and having to struggle for 3 months to get unemployment in the middle of this pandemic. 100,000 drivers were threatened during the pandemic last year and threatened to shut down, and Uber and Lyft threatened to shut down their companies because they couldn't get what they want. There are stories of drivers who have lost their lives, yet our companies, once again, were nowhere to be found. There are stories of drivers who have been exposed to COVID-19, yet too afraid to stop working for fear of financial ruin. And yet, these companies were nowhere to be found. More recently, Jeffrey Fang, a DoorDash driver in San Francisco, had his 2 children kidnapped in front of him while he was making a delivery. He'd been forced to take them with him, unable to afford childcare. The bottom line is this: app companies created a law because they don't want to pay for the employee benefits and protections of their drivers that their drivers have earned. In addition, we do not have the right to unionize, no form or structure to negotiate and address our complaints. The demographics of gig drivers looks like this. At least 78% of the workforce are African Americans and people of color. And we also know that 56% of them are immigrants. Over 71% more work 50 hours a week. In a survey performed by UCLA, half of the gig workers said they were forced to stop working because of the pandemic, and 76 said the pandemic reduced their hours. Despite the assurances by gig companies that anyone suffering from COVID-19 would receive paid time off, since sick leave is not guaranteed to us by law, workers have reported various problems accessing their pay or safely proving that they have contracted the disease. I want to suggest to you today that racial justice is economic justice, that the conditions that make police killings of Black people possible and inevitable are the same conditions that make the exploitation of Black and brown workers possible and inevitable. We have rejected their attempts to separate racial justice from economic justice. And we saw these corporations as an attempt to dodge their responsibility for the exploitation of Black and brown workers every day. We must be clear that in the era of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, this fight is not only about police killings and terror, it's about every institution that exploits and abuses Black and brown people and when in this country. And when it comes to exploiting Black and brown people, Lyft, Uber, DoorDash, Postmates companies are experts. You see, I know what it's like to be a gig worker, to work with these exploited app companies. So what are the factors that influence our organizing strategies? Because gig workers do not share a common workplace to cultivate relationships, it makes it challenging to gather and share information. Social media is the core of our work. We rely on text, phone calls, meetings, one-on-ones. We are not knocking on doors. However, we do perform actions, but they are not as frequent and come with protocols, which limits the number of people participating. The other thing to point out is that we ran up against a $205 million campaign here in California that co-opted our messaging centering Black and brown people. These companies were unconscionable. They forced drivers to click through an app messages warning them that they would lose their jobs. They sent notifications to riders, warning them of longer wait times and higher prices. They even spent part of their war chest convincing voters that it was racist to oppose the measure. A particular front when Lyft ran ads quoting Maya Angelou's "Lift Up Your Eyes" poem. And Uber bought billboards stating, "If you tolerate racism, delete Uber," to capitalize on the Black Lives Matter movement. All this while trying to strip away a majority of Black and brown workforce of fundamental labor rights. So in closing, I want to say this. We are in an epidemic of misclassification. Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, Instacart, and those corporations that are soon to follow have passed a law in California and plan to take this show across the nation. And unless we do something, this will be the future for nurses, for grocery workers, for store clerks, if we allow corporations to define regulations and create laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. And now I would like to introduce again Aaron Spires of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers.
Hi, everyone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with you all today. Like Enda said, my name is Aaron Spires. I'm a national union rep, but I'm a letter carrier out of BC. I just want to say how excited in some ways I am to talk about this, although I'll be talking a little bit differently about our experience organizing Foodora workers at in the Greater Toronto area, but I take a lot of inspiration from the work that folks like Sherry are doing. So just a little bit of history. Foodora was and is a large delivery company, a subsidiary of Delivery Hero, who is a international food delivery company. They have a lot of different brands, Food Panda and others across the world. you know, and like most of these companies, they do everything that they can to acquire market share. And that's what they did in Toronto in 2015, purchasing a company called Courier, which was kind of a Canadian grown startup that did food delivery from 2013 to 2015 before they were purchased. And in 2018, late 2018, we were contacted by a group of couriers, primarily folks that used to be paper messengers and CUPW. We, in the early part of the 2010s, late part of the aughts, organized a number of paper messengers in and around Toronto and Montreal. And so we seemed, I guess, in some ways like a natural fit for the couriers. And so they reached out to us, and we met with them to see how we could help. We had been in conversation with, or I had been in conversation with a number of Uber and Lyft drivers on the eastern side of the country, but it didn't lead to any substantive organizing at that time. And so we met with the folks, and it became fairly clear to us that this was something that, as a union, CUPW had to take up. I mean, for a couple of reasons. The one being that independent contractor fights are really important to CUPW. They're important to me just personally as well. The independent contractor kind of model, the misclassification that Sherry's talking about, you know, it's a tool of bosses to basically create a pool of underpaid labor, generally highly gendered, highly racialized workers. And then it also obviously has the effect of putting downward pressure on already established unionized labor, of which obviously we represent the postal sector. And it also made sense because CUPW as an organization had been for the last 35 years fighting independent contractor status. In particular, the Postal Service, Canada Post, used what were called rural route couriers, and primarily women as independent contractors, performing basically the exact same work that I do on a day-to-day basis, but again, as independent contractors and unable to unionize. And so we, through a series of organizing through the 90s and the early 2000s, were able to bring about 6,000 rural carriers into the union and remove that independent contractor status and give them full employee status. And they now represent about a fifth of our membership. And so, you know, just, you know, it's interesting, but we see the same thing here, and it's, you know, the paper messengers are, or the people that originally approached us, you know, skewed very male, and quite white, but that kind of hid a much larger pool of workers that were highly racialized, folks with precarious immigration status, international students, and others. And so, you know, it was really important for us, you know, trying to make sure that we did everything that we can to go as far and as wide and make sure that we were making connections with workers across the Greater Toronto area. And so in order to do that, I'll just kind of talk a bit about some of the strategies that we had. You know, oftentimes I think that we are in a situation where labor is unsure how to, like organized labor is unsure how to tackle the gig economy. And I think that there's obviously a lot of reasons for that. No centralized workplace. You know, you can't easily go to that factory gates and hold up the sign like Norma Ray saying union and have those conversations with people. But at the base level, we wanted to make sure that we had those conversations. So what we did was we started with that smaller group of a couple dozen workers, and we just started doing training on how to have one-on-one conversations and how to get out onto the streets and basically develop, whether it be a 30-second, a 2-minute, a 5-minute pitch while people were going into restaurants and going through the process of their day-to-day work. We'd try and give them any sort of opportunity we would take to have a conversation to see if we could get them to give a contact information and potentially come to a meeting. And so we did that basically non-stop for about 6 months. But we also did some things that tried to expand our reach through workshops that we would offer, whether that be how to fight parking tickets, which for a lot of the drivers becomes a really big issue. That helped us understand and map the city a little bit more and understand how the demographics shift based on whether you're riding a bike or you're driving a vehicle. We would hold workshops on how to winterize for riding in a Toronto winter, or how to fix your bike, or how to do your taxes, because as an independent contractor, obviously, that's something that is a little bit difficult. I have a hard time doing my own taxes, and so it definitely was something that was well attended. And so, through all of that, we were able to basically bring people in on a week-to-week basis to meetings that we were having, just trying to build an inside committee, one-on-one conversations to build an inside committee. And that committee built steadily for those 6 months or so until we plateaued. And I think that that's kind of what we're seeing, or what we've seen in a number of situations where, because we don't know everybody, because the work is so disparate, it's hard to reach folks. And so at that time, we made the decision to go public with our campaign. And so, that factor really influenced our strategy. And so we made a very, very large push in going public, made ourselves highly visible, and decided at that point to be out on the street every single day in high traffic areas with, very, very bright materials that you couldn't miss us if you were, 500 feet away, doing everything that we could to anybody that had a delivery bag on or had something in their vehicle near a restaurant. We'd be walking out to them and talking to them, continuing to build. And then the other thing that we did was we reached out to allies and communities for community support. We did things like order in days, which was pushing for allies to be calling for food, and then giving them everything that they needed to have the conversation with and give the information to couriers that would lead them to us, so that we could kind of get our numbers up, because at the end of the day, CPW's goal was certification of a union. And, I think that, just one of the things that unions could do differently is kind of, I think, in some ways shift to that kind of more one-to-one conversation. Because a lot of times what in conversation that I've had with union folk, and when I say that, I mean like organized labor again, they're afraid to have those one-on-one conversations because they don't know where they're going to lead and they don't know how many they're going to have. But the beauty of it is that you actually develop those relationships that you need, right? So without that, we just wouldn't have had any sort of success at all. So, after we were able to reach out to a critical mass of workers, hundreds upon hundreds of workers, having conversations with them and getting them to sign union cards, we dropped union cards and were forced into a 96-hour electronic vote of our membership, or of the proposed membership, which then followed mass postering campaigns, mass flyering campaigns, and basically an army of people calling hundreds of couriers day by day, asking them to vote, and not telling them how to vote, but asking them to get out there and vote, and walking them through the process to do so. And then in the end, that paid off. The labor board process is a slow one, but nearly 90% of those workers voted in favor of unionization. And I think that shows that, even though we couldn't reach every single person, the strength that we had and the desire for rights that have been denied, systematically denied these workers is very, very strong. So, I won't go on too much longer because I'm sure that I'm coming up on time, but I'll just say that I think that the big issue that we need to confront is the issue of misclassification. And I think that we need to confront that on as many levels as we can, whether that be through direct action on the bosses, whether that be through legislative battles or through union certification drives, without a singular focus in some ways on taking that struggle on, it's going to be a lot harder for us to win in the long term. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. So now Veronique will do a short summary of the presentation themes and is going to ask presenters a question to kick off the Q&A. And I'd also like to remind you to post your questions in the Q&A. We have 121 attending right now, so I'm sure there's lots of questions out there. So please, please let us have them. Thanks.
Yeah, so both Sherry and Aaron have underlined the ways in which platform companies rely on misclassification to leverage so-called flexibility, but essentially exploit precarious, gendered, and racialized workers. And as Sherry said, these platforms seem to be experts in exploiting Black and Brown people. So gig worker organizing has been one of the more exciting stories to emerge out of the labor movement in recent years, and you've both pointed to legal misclassification as the center of the struggle, but as you mentioned, Aaron, this effort was really as a first step to unionization. So I wonder if you guys could both expand on that. What can we learn from comparing recent legal and political strategies and grassroots organizing?
Aaron, you can go first.
Thanks. No, yeah, I mean, I think that it can't be one or the other, but I do think that we need to move away from a reliance on the legal framework as the end all be all. I think that our contexts are different in Canada and the US, not in the conditions of work necessarily, but in the abilities that we have legally to fight. For instance, I'll just make mention of concerted activity protection, which folks in the US have, but folks in Canada don't. At the end of the day, the legal battle that we took on after certification, which was about 5 or so months in front of the labor board, followed by another round of fighting after Foodora decided to pull up roots from the country. We had to be doing continuous organizing through that process to keep people involved, because if we weren't doing that, it ends up being a situation where the union gets third-partied. The union is this entity that just does something for you at a certain point. And when that happens, that's the death of the union as we know it, right? And so I think that, we need to, even when we're doing that legal struggle, we need that nonstop on the ground presence, continually building up the union as it should be, just a group of workers taking collective actions. So.
Yeah, I want to focus more on the organizing aspects, and so more on the behaviors rather than the legalities around it. And as I mentioned before, it's vital that we actually get comfortable around talking about race, that we don't treat race as a four-letter word, a bad word to not bring up in our organizing spaces. And so it's really critical that we talk about Black
Say
thought,
what?
we talk about the Black lived
Yes.
experience.
Yeah, I screwed up. I thought this.
If someone can put themselves on mute. We talk about the Black lived experiences of what the people themselves are saying about themselves, their experiences, and not what outsiders are looking in could describe. It's just essential that melanated people must be trusted with their experiences, their thought, their methodologies, their worldview, that could free us from this theology that corporations have of profit over people. If we rely on looking at 3 areas of organizing, if we rely on centering worker stories to be the center of any campaigning, in addition to having worker voices, not just at any table, but at the decision-making table. That's going to require a redistribution of power and worker organizing, particularly around being intentional about culture and being purposeful about building strong coalitions that include Black-led organizing. And so when I talk about worker stories, what I'm talking about are the real lives events that I mentioned about Jeffrey Fang, or workers who are living in their cars in the wealthiest country, the United States, and yet can't afford rent. Or a story of a driver who has chronic health condition, yet can't afford health insurance. So these are the stories that we want to make sure that we're centering when it comes to our organizing. We also want to make sure that when it comes to our organizing, that we look at the power of decision-making at the decision-making table, and to make sure that those who are impacted are actually represented. That we have the Black and brown and low-wage workers that need to have that seat at the table at the very beginning and not as an afterthought. A table that is comfortable around having a deeper analysis around race and how it fits into economic justice. And then finally, as I mentioned, worker organizing and being intentional about culture. Cultural change takes hold through consistency and repetition and relationships, not just on MLK Day or when Black History Month rolls around. It takes courage, and accountability, and transparency.
Thank you, Sherry. We've got a question. The questions are starting to roll in now, which is great. We have one which is coming to us from Southern California, and it's on the role of trade unions. So much of the organizing work around gig labor has happened externally to major official unions. Why have unions been, by and large, slow to respond to the transformations of the gig economy? And what do you think the work of these smaller efforts says about the future of the labor movement in the US and Canada? So whoever wants to go first.
So I think I've answered that question in a very general way, and it makes it really simple. And what I just said is that, in the era of Black Lives Matter and COVID-19, in order to eradicate what I would define as these ideologies that have slipped into our organization, so we don't have a vaccine of white supremacy around organizing. And so we must look at our own institutions and give a really good and clear audit about what are the things that we're doing that is actually contributing to the world that we don't want to see, and really practicing and being intentional about the world that we do want to see.
Yeah.
Eric?
Part of when you said the question, it just got muffled for me, so I'm going to try and answer. Just one of the things that I kind of wanted to, say about it is the role I was at a meeting of a bunch of staffers and union reps, and we were talking about Uber in particular at the time, but the gig economy more broadly, and a large union, one of their representatives was like, well, we just need to ban these companies. That's it. We're going in. That's how you win, because that's how you get power. And I think that power is kind of one of the issues, you know, talking about trade unions not necessarily getting involved. I think that organizing in the space and doing it the way that Sherry's talking about in particular actually challenges the power of bureaucrats in labor as well. And I think that's scary for them. And I think that, so, you know, it actually giving the space to voices, you know, whether it be Black and brown folks, whether it be women, you know, in labor is still for all of it's basically it's still a long way to go, let's say, because you know, take a look at my union. For years, it was basically just a white boys club. And so, you know, we've seen with our organizing with Foodora, we've seen organizing that we've done in the courier sector and in warehousing logistics. It's often racialized folks, it's often new immigrants, it's often folks that generally don't have, there's a latent fear of giving that voice, even among trade union bureaucrats, despite their best intentions.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. And you're cutting out a tiny bit, so hopefully that will improve for the last 20 minutes or so. I've got a question for Sherry. Before the Prop 22 vote, can you talk about any of the political support or lack of political support in California for drivers and ways workers and allies were involved? So I guess a question about broader public sentiment, either in support of or against workers, but also the kind of support that you received during that campaign.
I want to answer that question. What I'm hearing is, you know, what kind of political support that we have during the campaign, and what did we do to cultivate that relationship? That's how I'm going to answer the question. I think, what happened with Proposition 22 in that particular area around political support, and I'm also including that around the voters, was that not only were we in the middle of a pandemic and fighting for unemployment insurance, but we also had a duty of fighting against the proposition measure that was coming up in November. And we didn't have the base that I think we needed to have in order to win. And again, in addition to, we were fighting against a $205 million campaign. I haven't discussed this with my gig workers colleagues, but I would like to discuss it around drivers in general, whether or not we had a proper ideology around Proposition 22 as it relates to a race analysis, so that we could go to political folks and ask them for their support. And again, it goes by, I'm gonna repeat myself like a record. I believe that because we didn't have that proper analysis, and because we didn't have relationships with the folks like the NAACP, for example, or brown folks in their coalitions, that it's on us. Again, you know, there were some victories around our organizing. We were able to build a group that included driver groups and non-organizing partners and allies to defeat the proposition that included unions. We were able to provide some successful collective campaign actions, such as a statewide caravan. We created some high visibility actions around handing out PPE in front of Uber and Lyft locations or holding out signs. But again, I'm gonna look to us as relates to how we move forward and whether or not, you know, we have the ability to be a tight-knit coalition that can be in alignment with its ideologies and strategies about how we move forward.
Okay, so we have a question from Vancouver, and this is the question: Our union, the ACWU, which is the Arts and Cultural Workers Union, with the support of the international union IATSE, is working on developing worker and platform cooperatives as an alternative to exploitative gig and freelance work for artists and cultural workers. And this person is interested to know if either panelist or their organizations are exploring union-supported cooperatives as alternatives to platform ventures.
Sorry, I got kicked off there. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So just briefly, I mean, yeah, so in about 2 months after we got the recognition as that they were no longer independent contractors from the Labor Board, Foodora pulled roots from the Canadian market, and in the middle of a pandemic kind of left a lot of workers unemployed. And so, you know, they work a lot of apps and we continue to work with them, but we kind of have gone down 3 different streams of continual organizing. And one of those is there is a group of couriers, you know, and we're supporting a little bit on the back end, developing a plan and trying to put in place the infrastructure for a platform co-op for food delivery in the Greater Toronto area. You know, we think that it's a good idea for the couriers to explore, and I think that overall there's a general support. But it's going to be a difficult fight against deeply entrenched players like an Uber or a DoorDash or the others. Yeah, we are exploring it, and I'd be happy, more than happy, to chat with the folks from the Arts and Culture Workers Union about that afterwards. Maybe put them in touch with some of the couriers to see if there's a possibility to collaborate.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Sherry, did you want to speak to that question? You're on mute.
Aaron did a really good job.
Okay, thank you. So I have another question which I am interested to ask you. I think that one of the more fascinating aspects of gig worker organizing has been the use of communication technology by workers and organizers. And Sherry, you were mentioning this during your talk. This has ranged from using corporate platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook to, in some cases, developing purpose-built platforms for worker organizing. And here I'm thinking of the rideshare drivers union in California and the Solidarity app that they've developed. And I know that at least one of them is in attendance today. Could you tell us a little bit more about how communication technologies have been used in the platforms that, or in the campaigns rather, that you've been involved in?
Yes, so going to RDU's Solidarity app as a means to engagement, to develop one-on-ones. It's about relationships. And so it's a means of making contacts with drivers and addressing their concerns and their decisions around what they would like to do. So really agitating agency. Gig Workers Rising also has an app called Workers First, to address and to provide as a means for providing data collection to post Proposition 22. They've made several promises with this proposition. So it's a means to help us around our movement building. And like I said before, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So we're not knocking on doors. We're not doing some of the traditional organizing and having engagements with folks and sitting in their living rooms and dens. And also, for whatever reason, the organizing around making phone calls is dismissed. So the other option is using social media such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, whatever it is to make contact as a ways of engaging and getting hooked up to drivers.
Thanks. Aaron, did you want to take a crack at answering that question?
Well, I mean, just in terms of communications platforms and our experience using them. So a lot of I mean, obviously we're using things like messenger groups, WhatsApp, a lot of Slack, whether it be the company had one, but then the couriers obviously had their own. And you know, kind of building out of that, a lot of, as our list started to grow, we started to make more contacts. We were using, whether it be something like a Haymarket or a Nation Builder to do kind of like mass blasts out to couriers. But what we found most effective was having basically just a crew of folks doing text messages and phone calls to try and have those one-on-ones, developing a stewards network where, you know, a steward is responsible for 20 to 30 people, so that regularly each steward is calling those 20 to 30 people and developing those relationships and building them up and trying to, you know, work those folks up a kind of that ladder of engagement and get them more and more involved in the union throughout the process. Because, you know, when it comes to communications technologies, the boss has a lot of power there. During their anti-union campaign, they were using push notifications through the app, trying to convince the workers that they were going to be spending $1,000 a year on dues and a bunch of other different communications tools. And, you know, the workers can't shut that off because it's part of their livelihood, right? So we're at a structural disadvantage there. So we certainly use it, but anything that we can to have those actual direct conversations have been more fruitful, I'd say.
Thanks, Aaron. I've got another question, which I think is a really interesting one. And essentially, it makes the point that gig workers are competing with traditional employees in the economy for jobs, and that this competitive pressure often drives wages and benefits down and fails gig workers with a lack of fundamental rights in labor law because of misclassification. And the question is around how to develop solidarity among gig workers and those who are more in kind of standard employment relationships. And I think that the question is maybe especially interesting given that at some of the platform companies, I'm thinking Amazon, Google, Facebook, we have seen some really interesting examples of solidarity organizing among contractors and full-time workers. So I'm wondering whether you might be able to reflect on the potential for solidarity organizing among contractors and permanently employed workers.
You muted the last part of your question there, and
Sorry. I'm wondering whether you might be able to reflect on the possibilities of organizing, solidarity organizing among workers who are in permanent positions and contractors such as the ones that you have organized with.
So that is a great question. I want to meet that person who actually brought it up because that for me is an example of a narrative that divides workers. It's a myth to not cause us to be in solidarity. The competition is about making sure that all workers are treated with dignity and respect, that all workers have a home to go to, that they're not facing housing insecurity, that they have health benefits, that when they go to work, that they know how much money they're going to be paid. And so the competition is not with classified employees and gig workers. Everybody wants to be treated as a human. And so I've been engaged in solidarity with Amazon workers, with other Fight for 15 with McDonald's workers. Because everybody wants to be treated with dignity, right? When you have a $1 million corporation who buys you doggy diapers as opposed to proper PPE, it is a common interest of making sure not only workers are protected, but also the ones that they also serve. And so it's vital as we organize to look at the means in the narratives around what is attempting to divide us rather than join us. And that's one of the narratives.
Aaron, did
can't
you want to
say-
try and?
No, I can't say it better than that.
Okay, we'll leave it at that then. We have what I think is probably going to be our last question, and this is an important one. In fact, we've got a number of questions that are in and around this topic, and it's probably important for us to include this. So people are wondering what misclassification of workers looks like in each of your two contexts. So I'm wondering whether you could describe how that has happened. You, Sherry, in California, and you, Aaron, working in Ontario.
So I'll take the approach about how that happened. So it started under the Dynamex decision in 2018, when the California legislators adopted 3 factors in determining the status of workers known as the ABC test. And in this 3-pronged approach, it was trying to help legislators determine whether or not one was an employee or whether one was indeed, an independent contractor. And there were 3 questions for consideration. One was whether or not under Lyft and Uber's, whether or not folks were under Lyft and Uber's control. That meant that we were an employee. The second question was whether or not we were providing services in the company's usual course of business. We're considered an employee. The third prong was the consideration of we're not regularly holding a business like another Lyft or Uber business, independent business, such as a small business. We're an employee. They were also looking at, whether or not we set our own rates, whether or not we were able to make our own decisions, looking at the algorithms that was with this app. And so this Dynamex decision for us not only addressed the independent contractor status, but it also addressed the minimum wage status. However, it didn't address the other employee benefits like state disability, workman's compensation should you get into a car accident, unemployment insurance in the middle of a pandemic. And so 2019 came, and AB5 helped to address the reach and effect of the Dynamex decision. Proposition 22 came about because you had corporations that disagreed with legislators. So essentially, they purchased themselves a multi-million dollar law to accept their responsibilities for treating their employees with labor with dignity and respect. And as such, we are now not considered independent contractors, and we don't have employee benefits or protections. We are now sitting in our cars. That's controlled by an algorithm, not determining whether or not we get up early in the morning to meet the commute. We can't determine whether or not how much we're going to get paid. We're exempt from employee status, from employee benefits, so that in the middle of a pandemic, folks will not be covered if they get sick or if they die. And there is no remedy to address our complaints. I could be discriminated based on the color of my hair, or a sexual assault complaint, and have a proper process to go through. So that's misclassification. The ability to not have to exercise what's yours to do because you work hard to get it. And I'm complete.
Thanks, Sherry. Aaron, do you want to tell us a little bit about the context in Ontario?
Yeah, sure. So, there's a lot of similarities there, and you talk about the Dynamex decision. Dynamex has actually been purchased by a Canadian company called T-Force, and we represent those couriers in a number of places across the country. And the kind of quantum test that you're talking about, all of the different factors are very similar here as they are, or it sounds like they're similar here as they are in California, and there are variations across the country depending on the province. But I don't know if it's the same in California, but we've got a third category in most provinces, most jurisdictions, called dependent contractor, which a dependent contractor is this kind of limbo position that under the Employment Standards Act or under, sorry, the labor relations codes often can access unionization and collective bargaining, but still employers don't have to do everything that they would have to do for a full employee under the law. And so, you know, we have a situation where couriers, and in our situation in Ontario, the couriers actually sought that status. They sought the middle ground status for fear that the company might pull roots if they were full employees. But that kind of gives us an ability to take that first step towards unionization and collective bargaining, you know, without necessarily putting all of the chips on the table immediately, and then gives us an opportunity to push for the status after the fact. Although I will say that's a little bit difficult. I will say, just kind of building on or taking from what Sherry was saying around hard work, in the decision that the Labor Board gave us, you know, basically the companies all try and say, listen, what you're doing is entrepreneurial activity, even though they control all facets of the work. You know, the Labor Board basically said, yeah, okay, it's hard work, but hard work can't be mistaken for entrepreneurial activity. Just because you're you know, dual apping, working Lyft and Uber at the same time, or just because you're pushing hard, at the end of the day, the company controls the app and the algorithm controls the work, and you have no control. And so you know, I think that that's the key thing that we have to think about through this process. And also, you know, and this is something that AB5 attempted to do, but shift the onus onto the employer, not onto the worker, right? Like, at the very minimum, let's not leave it up to the worker to prove that they are an employee. Let's leave it up to the employer to prove that they're not.
Thank you, Aaron. And it is now 1 o'clock here on the West Coast. So I think we need to wrap up what I believe has been a very successful event. Thank you so much to Sherry and Aaron and Veronique, and to everyone for attending, and to everyone that helped produce this event today. I want to offer a reminder that this is only the first in a series. And so there will be more updates coming your way by email and on the Labor Studies program website in the school at Simon Fraser University. So thank you very much to everyone, and hope to see you at the next webinar event.